Hello, everybody. Welcome to the recording of our presentation. We are the Nova Scotia chapter of the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, also known as CPAWS, and today we're going to be showcasing our findings from our snorkeling fieldwork over the past 2 summers here in Nova Scotia. So we really love the underwater world, and we hope this presentation shows that and that you can truly see that it is an underwater playground here in Nova Scotia, and that it hopefully inspires you to explore it as well. So before we begin, we want to acknowledge that the work we've conducted is done on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. On behalf of CPAWS, we'd also like to recognize the connection that the Mi'kmaq share with this land and our surrounding oceans. And as an organization, CPAWS follows the lead of Indigenous people as they are the stewards of the land and leaders in conservation. So we're first going to introduce ourselves. So my name is Madie. I use she, her pronouns. I'm originally from Ottawa and moved here to Nova Scotia to do my undergrad at Dalhousie in marine biology, and then went on to do my master's in marine biology at the University of Bremen in Germany. My interests are in marine mammals, coral reefs, as well as marine conservation, science education, and also communication.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ange Whiteway, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm the manager of policy and planning at CPAWS Nova Scotia, and I'm originally from Toronto, Ontario, but I moved to the beautiful Annapolis Valley when I was 11. And that's definitely where I decided that I wanted to go into marine conservation. So I studied biology and political science at Mount Allison University. And before living my marine biologist dream, I worked in riparian restoration, wetland management, salt marsh research, fisheries biology, and finally, marine conservation.
Hello, everybody. My name is Hunter Stevens. I use he, him pronouns. I'm actually from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and I made the journey out east in 2019 to pursue a master's degree in Atlantic salmon movement and behavior at Dalhousie University. Following that, I did a little bit of teaching at Dalhousie, and my interests broadly were in invertebrate and fish biology, taxonomy, science communication, and fieldwork safety. So as the manager of aquatic research at CPAWS-NS, I'm in charge of coordinating all of the fieldwork and a lot of the safety behind the snorkel surveys that you're going to see today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Taylor Creaser. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a conservation campaigner with CPAWS Nova Scotia. I'm born and raised in Nova Scotia. I grew up in the Annapolis Valley in a small town. I then went on to study environmental science at Mount Allison University. I've worked in the not-for-profit sector for about the past 5 years or so. I've worked with various species at risk, such as American eel, snapping turtles, and eastern ribbon snake. And I also have a lot of experience with water quality monitoring, habitat restoration, specifically streams, and environmental education.
We also wanted to give a quick shout out to another member of our team, Tegan Labor, who's pictured in these photos here. She comes with us on every one of our fieldwork expeditions and takes a ton of awesome videos of the work that we do and compiles them into videos that you can find either on our social media or YouTube. So check those out if you have time. Getting into CPAWS as an organization, we stand for the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, and we're a national charity organization that advocates for protecting land and ocean across Canada. So CPAWS Nova Scotia does things a little bit differently than the rest of the country. We are very fieldwork focused. So throughout the summer, we're outside a lot and doing these snorkel surveys that we're going to talk about in this presentation. And Nova Scotia is this perfectly small province, so it's logistically feasible for us to travel from one side to the other quite easily. And we have a highly trained team of freedivers that double as biologists and environmental scientists that are really passionate about what we do. So hopefully that comes out in this presentation. To give a general overview of the presentation, we're going to talk about the fieldwork that we do, and then we're going to get into our findings. So you can come along with us into the ocean for that, and then we're going to talk about ways that you can get involved with CPAWS.
All right, so what we're presenting today is, again, actually just a general overview of these marine biodiversity surveys, or more simply, snorkel surveys. So we visit remote areas of Nova Scotia and actually get into the water to observe and document Nova Scotia's marine biodiversity. This means that our team has to have a pretty high training regimen. We're all certified free divers. Safety is our #1 consideration, so there's lots of logistics that go into this beforehand, such as scouting out the site before we actually get into it. And to start off this presentation, we're going to go over all of these considerations that we have to make before we actually do get into the water.
So, as Hunter mentioned, we are often in really remote areas of the province. So, actually, the first step is getting to our sites, which may sound easy, but isn't always. We are often surveying coastal islands or other sites that aren't easily accessible from the mainland. So, this requires us to charter a boat or to use sea kayaks to get to where we need to go to survey. So, when doing this, we're always really cognizant of safety. That's our top priority. We're considering the wind, the weather conditions, and we often contract local guiding companies to help make sure we get to our site safely. Shout out to Cape Lahave Adventures, who have taken us across the province in many different surveys. So, we also need to consider our packing when we're doing this. We need to make sure that all of the gear that we're bringing will either fit in our sea kayaks or we can carry on our backs. So this means our fins, our wetsuits, all of our camera gear, thermal layers so we can stay warm and dry, lunch and water. We need to make sure that whatever we're packing out to our sites that we can then bring back. So we're often sea kayaking, but sometimes we're hiking to our sites as well. The top picture in the top right-hand corner shows us bringing all of our gear into the woods. Our furthest site is about 5 kilometers one way. That may not sound like a lot, but when you're coming back with all of your wet gear, it definitely can make for a long day. And lastly, sometimes our sites are pretty close by. So to avoid carrying all of this gear in and out of the fields, we can put it on at the car sometimes. We don't do this very often, but when we have, it's definitely attracted the attention of some passerbys who've wondered what we're doing.
All right, so once we've made it safely to our site and we've assessed the conditions as well as the entry points into the water, we'll then put on all of our gear. So as Taylor mentioned, we have lots of gear that we use, and a lot of this is to keep us warm in the water because as I'm sure you know, the water here in Nova Scotia is very cold. So generally we wear a 7 millimeter thick wetsuit, but sometimes when it's especially cold, we'll wear dry suits as well. So once we're suited up, we'll pair up with a buddy and we'll try to stay close to each other while we're surveying. This is mostly for safety, but also to have a second pair of eyes on something cool or something that we don't really know what it is and we need some help to identify it. So we'll try to move as much as we can around the site and cover as much ground as possible. We'll look through the entire water column and also move some seaweed gently out of the way to find any critters that are hiding there. So we use what's called an arm slate. So this is a piece of plastic. You can sort of see it in that left photo there. So we wear that on our arms and it has a little pencil on it so we can write down every single species we see and then also estimate the abundance at that site. Another important consideration for us is that we always need a spotter on land. So this is for safety. So this person will be keeping track of all the divers in the water, making sure no one's getting swept away in a current or getting too close to boat traffic. And they will also be the first person to call for emergency services if needed. And then occasionally, if logistics allow it, we will have a spotter on a kayak in the water with us as well.
So getting into the water and getting the observations that we do does come with a number of challenges. And when we're in the water itself, there is a great deal of multitasking going on. So in the water, like Taylor mentioned, we're contending with things like currents, wave action, possible obstructions, organisms that might not want to be photographed, like fish. They swim away so fast before you can even snap a shot of them. As well as unidentifiable organisms. So sometimes we come into contact with something that we're not immediately familiar with. So in that case, we take a lot of photos and then we can consult with the scientific community afterwards, send our pictures to some friends and see if we can get a solid ID on something that we haven't seen before. When we're also doing these freediving surveys, we are contending with depth as well. So as freedivers, When you go down to a certain depth, you can feel pain in your ears, and this is similar. It's a similar feeling to when you're in an airplane or driving through the mountains and you feel your ears pop. It's also for the same reason. So there's air in your ear spaces that when you dive to depth becomes more condensed and compressed, and it becomes painful as it presses on your eardrums. So to avoid getting injured, we have to be very familiar with what's called equalizing. And this means that you're relieving this pressure off of your eardrums by either wiggling your jaw, swallowing, or plugging your nose and blowing out gently onto your plugged nose to reintroduce more air into your ear spaces and your sinuses. And then the pain goes away and you can keep on diving. So the multitasking that's happening when we're doing each dive, we're taking a breath, we're not doing scuba, so no breathing of compressed air. We're taking a deep breath, we're diving down. You're dealing with the waves and the currents. You're trying to like focus your camera on something that might not want to be photographed. And I sometimes like to anchor myself to a rock. We're trying not to disturb any like seaweed and stuff. We're trying to be non-destructive in the environment that we're surveying in. And you're sometimes floating back to the top quicker than you anticipated. So a lot of work goes into all the pictures that we're going to show you, and we're really proud of the pictures that we've got. So hopefully that comes through in these photos.
So at this point, we've selected our sites, we've gotten ourselves to the sites, we've conducted the snorkeling surveys, and we've done all of that multitasking that Ange just elaborated on for you folks. When we get out of the water, sometimes we're a little bit tired. So we'd like to take a break on the shoreline. This is a really great opportunity for us to get out of our wetsuits, to find somewhere that's like dry to sit, to have a break for lunch, and to also warm up. So as you can see in the photo here, there's a lot of knotted wrack covering the shoreline. So we do have to make do with the conditions at the locations where we're surveying, and we do our best to find somewhere dry and out of the elements to take a rest in between surveys. As you can also see here, it looks like there's a little bit of a gear explosion on the shoreline. We oftentimes have a lot of people, and we do bring all of that gear with us. So when we're done at a site, we have to be really, really diligent that we pack out everything that we've brought in. We try our best to follow leave no trace principles, and this means leaving nothing behind. So we're pretty good and pretty vigilant about doing a great scan of the shoreline to make sure we have all of our gear packed up and with us. We also don't want to leave anything that we need behind, such as our camera gear or our wetsuits. And I think we're doing pretty good so far. We have had one case of the missing fins where a pair of fins was left on a rock as the tide was coming in, and we had to send a boat back on a rescue mission to get them. We were able to successfully retrieve them before the tide swept them away, so I'd say we're doing pretty good.
And finally, we just want to highlight something that makes our work so exciting if you're not already picking up on how much we love doing what we do. But wherever you're watching this video right now, if you just take a quick look around the room that you're in, everything is pretty predictable in terms of placement. Nothing's really floating through the air or like sticking to weird surfaces. When we do these snorkel surveys and we're underwater, we're entering a 3D environment where every single surface and everywhere around us is surveyable, and we can find the critters and animals living. So we find animals in the water column, hanging out under ledges, attached to seawalls, hiding in crevices, cracks. It's a really incredible environment that we enter when we do these snorkel surveys. So there's no up and there's no down. So when we're doing these surveys, we're really excited to get into the water and enter this awesome 3D environment. So we're going to take you along with us for that.
All right, so we're going to begin by talking about some of the places that we do these surveys. So safety being our number one consideration, a sheltered cove jumps out as being a really nice prospective site. When you've got shelter from the prevailing wind or wave action and wind, That prevents sediment and stuff from being tossed up and makes the visibility a lot better. So it's not only safer, but it allows us to survey more efficiently.
Exposed shorelines is another place that we survey sometimes. These areas can be a little bit more exposed to wave action and wind action that Hunter was talking about. So they require good conditions, and we definitely need to assess these areas before we get into the water.
So Nova Scotia is home to thousands of islands off its main coast, and most of these have really beautiful and unique underwater ecosystems. This is often because they're relatively undisturbed and sometimes also uninhabited. So these kinds of trips, as amazing as they are, they do require a lot more logistics and planning, and oftentimes we'll have to charter a boat or a local guide, or sea kayaks like we mentioned earlier.
We also survey river estuaries, and these are the areas where rivers are flowing out into the ocean, and you get brackish water where the fresh water and the salt water are mixing. So these areas are unique because you can expect to have species that are found both in marine and freshwater environments.
So before we get on to the cool species that we get to see, we're going to touch a bit on the habitats that we encounter. So firstly, we have eelgrass, and this is one of our favorites. It's absolutely beautiful to see moving in the water, and there's also lots of cool critters living amongst it. So eelgrass meadows are a super important habitat, and just like coral reefs and mangroves and rainforests, they capture carbon from the atmosphere. They also provide habitat and nursery grounds for important species, and also provide food. However, eelgrass, just like most seagrasses around the world, is threatened by coastal development and habitat destruction. And it was actually almost completely wiped out here in Nova Scotia in the last century. Luckily, it's made a bit of a comeback, but there's still lots of work being done to protect it. So CPAWS Nova Scotia is actually a partner on a community eelgrass restoration initiative, which is based out of Dalhousie University. So they're doing great work to combine science and community outreach to protect and promote the protection of eelgrass.
A very common habitat type that we see on our surveys are macroalgal stands. So these stands of either knotted frac or escaphyllum or fucus species often tower through a water column, and they host thousands of critters on their blades. We've found juvenile species of mollusk, fish, and crustaceans seeking shelter within these impressive stands, and they add a lot of structure for encrusting species like anemones as well to make use of their fronds.
One of the less common, unfortunately, habitat types that we do find are kelp beds. So kelp used to be quite common again throughout the eastern shore, but for a number of reasons, including invasive species and changing environmental conditions, it has kind of been on the decline. This is unfortunate because kelp provides a really great habitat and structure and shelter for a number of juvenile fish species, all sorts of invertebrates, and also just for other algae actually that grows on the blades of it themselves. One of the rarer habitat types that we encounter too is what's called an oyster reef. So an oyster reef, as the name implies, is kind of analogous to a coral reef in the sense that you've got these successive generations of organisms building on top of one another to form a more complex habitat. So the first generation of oysters will live and die, and then successive generations will build their own shells on top of the discarded shells of the old generation. This creates a 3D habitat for all sorts of little invertebrates and places for fish to hide, and also filters out different sorts of organisms from the water column. These oysters are filter feeders.
We also survey habitats with sandy and rocky bottoms, and this habitat type probably requires a little less explanation than the others. If you've been to the beach in Nova Scotia, you've probably seen it. So we still expect to find a lot in these areas, such as species that are adapted to hide between rocky crevices, encrust on rocks, blend into the sandy substrate, or species that are really good at defense and don't need to hide like jellyfish. We also encounter microhabitat types in addition to those major habitats on this slide is either encrusting or branching
in these surveys. But it's not just being able to list off all these different fish and invertebrates. It's also about knowing what features to look at or photograph in order to identify them. So here we've got two species of flounder. On the left is a less common window pane flounder, and on the right is a fairly common winter flounder. So flounder, flatfish, when they're young, they start off with an eye on either side of their head. It's only when they're a couple months old, actually, that one of those eyes is going to move all the way to the other side of the head, and that fish is going to fall down onto its side, and that's how it's going to live out its life. Depending on which eye migrates, you can actually tell which flounder is which. You can tell them apart from each other. So on the left-hand side, you'll notice that the window pane flounder's mouth faces to the right, to its right, and the winter flounder's mouth faces to its left. So that's an immediately distinguishing feature that we can look at, photograph, and say later, oh, this is two different animals. These are two different species.
Getting into a staff favorite for us here at CPAWS, the northern pipefish. And if you're looking at this animal and thinking that it looks kind of familiar, you would be right. It is a distant cousin of the seahorse. And similarly to the seahorse, the northern pipefish, in a mated pair, the male actually takes on paternal responsibilities of keeping the babies in a brood pouch and then giving birth to the babies as well. So dad of the year in terms of the northern pipefish. And yes, so super excited to have that disturbance. A undisturbed habitat because they're very weak swimmers and they also like to just hang out. They're very find them. So they're not very resistant to any kind of bottom contact, bottom disturbance, and boat traffic. We like to tell communities where we find these guys that we have found them there. So to be careful in the environment as well. We find many different morphologies of these animals, and you can see here they're masters of camouflage. They're super tough to find because they hang out. They're so still, like I mentioned, and they also just blend in terrifically. So the one on the left is blending in with knotted rack, and the one on the right is a morphology we see more commonly, and I find that it looks almost identical to the piece of eelgrass that you can see it hanging out right next to. And it's very common to mistake pieces of eelgrass for pipefish and vice versa. So we're really excited when we find these animals in the water.
So natural selection demands that animals be highly adapted to their environment, and animals will adopt a number of different strategies in order to obtain food and to prevent themselves from becoming food. So camouflage is one of these really prevalent strategies. We just saw it in the pipefish, but we want to highlight it in this shorthorn sculpin. These fish are really, really successful, and we see them a lot in different surveys across Nova Scotia. They like to sit on the bottom and stay really still. And this works for them because they are really good at color matching. They can actually sort of shift how they look to match their environment. So here, this big sculpin, you can see it's surrounded by red algae, and so it has changed color to match that accordingly. In the top right, we've got one that's living in more of a cobblestone and coralline algae environment, and you can see it's adopted a way more mottled coloration to sort of disrupt its outline and follow that sort of cobblestone coralline algae pattern.
So keeping on the theme of sometimes hard to see animals when we're doing our surveys, we have here on the left the sea raven, which is actually the larger cousin of the sculpins that we saw in the past slide. So similarly, it adopts a pretty bright color, so it blends in with red algae, but it's also adapted some like frilly beard and frilly fins that sort of look like algae as well. So it allows it to sort of hide in plain sight and be able to match with the algae around it. And then we also have the rock gunnel here on the right. So this is a little fish that we would call a cryptic species because generally we don't find them out in the open and they're pretty much always tucked between some rocks or under some algae. So you can see in this big photo here that he's just poking his head out a little bit, And then on the smaller photo, that's what it would look like when it's fully out. So this is something we have to keep in mind when we're surveying, because there are often little things that are hiding, and we want to make sure we're surveying as much as we can and writing down all the species that we are able to find. So here we have a pretty familiar animal that you've probably eaten before or seen in the grocery store. This is the American lobster. So we tend to see these guys on almost every survey around the province. They're really common, but they don't really like to be approached. So they have quite strong personalities, and often if they feel threatened or disturbed, they'll just jet backwards and leave a puff of sand in their wake, just to get away from us. However, we've had a few times where they were not scared of us and actually were interested in the camera. So in these big photos here, we actually had their antennas going over the lens, and it made for some really cool photos up close of their faces, and we get to see their emotion, which we're not sure what emotion, but we hope they love us, but probably not. And then we have in this smaller photo here, a lobster in a burrow. So they'll use these burrows for protection, so from predation, but also especially when they're molting. So when they're molting, they're really soft and they don't have their carapace to keep them safe anymore. So they like to burrow to keep themselves protected. So if we see a lot of burrows on a site, this can give us an indication about how the site's being used, and also its importance for some different life stages for different species as well.
Here's another species for all of the seafood lovers out there. This is what a bay scallop looks like before it makes it to your dinner plate. So all of those blue dots that you can see so well in this photograph are actually the scallop's eyes. And they can see, but not the same way as you and I. They have a rudimentary vision that detects light. So when shadows pass over them, as a defense against predation, they clamp their upper and lower valves together to try to stay safe. Another really exciting and fun fact about scallops is that they actually can kind of swim through the water column. This is another defense against predation, but they clamp their valves open and close really, really rapidly, and it will jet propel them a short distance away to try to escape anything that might predate them. All right, and on this slide, you can see a school of sand lance. When we get in the water at a site and we see schools of fish, we get really, really excited. This is one of the common species that we see, but we also commonly find native herring and alewife, which are another native species to Nova Scotia. So these sand lance, they're a forage fish. A lot of different things eat them, and they will hide and dive in the sand when they feel threatened. They're a really good indicator of a healthy environment. And when we see them at our sites, like I mentioned, we get really excited because it means that there's things for these fish to eat. It means there's places for them to hide, and it means that there's likely other organisms around that will eat these fish. So normally the habitats where we find schools of fish are really, really healthy and diverse ecosystems. As an aside, Ange mentioned this earlier, but I find fish to be one of the hardest things that we take photos of, especially individual fish. Most of them aren't very friendly, and when they see you, they dart away super quickly because they think that you're a predator. So taking photos of fish that are clear and in focus actually takes a really high degree of skill, and it's pretty tricky sometimes.
All right, so another pretty common and probably recognizable species. This is a jellyfish, and specifically the lion's mane jellyfish. So we see these guys often in colder water, which is usually the beginning of the summer or in the spring. But there's some places in Nova Scotia where you'll find these year-round, generally in Cape Breton. So these guys can't move on their own. They have to move on the currents and the waves, so they can't really control where they're going, which means when we're in the water and there's some of these around us, we have to be really careful and try to avoid them as well. Because as you can sort of see in this photo, it's a bit cut off because we couldn't fit the whole organism in one frame, but it has really long tentacles, and they probably go on for tens more feet as well. So it can be risky to get caught up in these tentacles, especially when you're getting distracted taking a photo. So we don't want to hurt the animal and rip off any of its tentacles, but we also don't want to get stung ourselves either. So these are one of my personal favorite things to photograph and to see. They're absolutely beautiful in the water, and like the light hits them and they're undulating their bell through the water column. So one of our favorite things, and it's also usually the start of field season. So we're usually pretty excited.
Now, lion's mane jellyfish may be the most charismatic and largest gelatinous organism in the water, but there is no shortage of cool zooplankton to be found off Nova Scotia's shores. Excuse me. Broadly, you can sort of classify them into two groups. There's the ctenophores, which we have here on the left, and on the right, the cnidarians. So cnidarians are all the jellyfish, anemones, corals, and one thing that all cnidarians have in common is that they have the capacity to sting. They have stinging cells. That is the unifying characteristic of this animal group. The ctenophores cannot sting. They do not have these stinging cells. So that is a key difference here. A lot of people get nervous when they see ctenophores washing up on the beach because they think that they can be stung, but actually they cannot. Another key difference is how they move. You'll notice that the cnidarians pictured here, they've all got this sort of bell-looking shape. So they move by contracting that bell and using jet propulsion. The ctenophores use these beautiful little ridges that you can see in the photos here that are covered in really small little oars called teens, which gives rise to the name ctenophore. They beat all of these oars in synchronicity, and this allows them to sort of smoothly glide through the water with minimal movement. A lot of people think that they produce their own light, and some species do, but the rainbow effect that you see here in these photos from the ctenophores is actually just it refracting light. It's the structure of the teens that sort of bends light like a prism and makes it look like it's giving off a rainbow. So these are an animal that a lot of people are familiar with, and we sort of take them for granted and think that they're common. But green sea urchin have actually become fairly uncommon and almost rare off the eastern coast of Nova Scotia. This is because of a disease that moved through the population that was quite virulent and killed off a lot of the population, actually, and it didn't really receive a lot of attention. A lot of people didn't really realize this. It was a couple of scientists that sort of raised the alarm on it. So this is one organism where we really try to keep track of where it occurs, and if it occurs in high numbers, definitely logging down that location for future monitoring. Generally, when we find green sea urchin, we actually only find maybe one or two individuals. There's only been one spot so far where this picture is from where we found quite a high number of them.
All right, so again, another pretty recognizable species. This is the common sea star. And despite their really cute appearance, they're actually quite vicious predators. So they can expel their entire digestive system out of their body and onto their prey item and actually digest it from the outside and then suck up all the nutrients into its body. So this means that they can take down prey that's a lot bigger than themselves because they don't have to actually eat it in their mouth. They just dissolve it and then take it in. So it also means that they're very important in the food chain and in the ecosystem. So surprisingly, we don't see these guys very often on our surveys. They are quite cryptic and generally hide and crack, so that could be a reason. But it could also be an indication that maybe their numbers are also declining, similar to the green sea urchin, or their distribution is changing from when they're normally found. So this is something we keep in mind when we're doing our surveys and making our reports at the end of the year. So we're able to sort of share this information and monitor where we're seeing these organisms that aren't super common.
Another one of our favorite finds when we're in the field, or more so my favorite find, is the anemone. So anemone are so exciting to photograph. It makes me feel like I'm diving somewhere that's not the cold Atlantic Ocean, but somewhere more colorful and tropical. Anemone are sessile animals that live their lives attached to surfaces, and surfaces can include boulders, large rocks, or wharves, and they do prefer areas where water current is the highest because they rely on their food to float by them on the passing water. So this organism is a predator whose diet consists of copepods, worm larvae, mollusk larvae, ascidian larvae, amphipods, and barnacle larvae. The one on the left is a plumose anemone, and we see this one most often on our surveys. They come in a range of sizes. You can see some that have very long stalks or more short and stubby like this one. I've also run into a group of anemone that actually had their tentacles inverted, so they looked like small pumpkins underwater. And at first I wasn't sure what I was looking at, but turns out they were anemones. And then the one here on the right was a really exciting find for us because at first when we photographed it, we thought it was just another plumose anemone. And then it was pointed out that it actually has stripes on it. So we had to do some digging for an ID, and it's a striped anemone. And it was the first recording of this animal in the LaHave Islands where we found it. And something also very interesting was that it was attached to a piece of seaweed, which we don't often see because usually anemone choose to live on more consistent, like a more consistent surface that isn't also floating through the water column. So it's definitely made us take a closer look at seaweed when we do these surveys. Getting into some of the mollusk species that we see, the one here on the left is a lacuna snail, and we often find them in eelgrass meadows. And this is not a lone occurrence of this snail. When we do find eelgrass, we find thousands of lacuna snail on the blades. I love this picture that Madie took because it looks like a small snail on a highway overpass rushing on its way to work or something. And then the snail here in the middle is a smooth periwinkle. We see these oftentimes, and this one's hanging out on a piece of knotted wrack. And then the one here on the right is a really exciting find for us. We don't always find moon snails, but when we do, we're really excited. This one was found in Cape Breton, and it was quite large. And these animals are like the Godzilla of the sea floor. They are a voracious predator that will hunt down smaller snails by jumping onto their slime trails that they leave behind. They will hunt down the smaller snail, engulf it, and then using a tool called a radula, they'll drill a small hole into their shell and then suck out the smaller snail and eat it. So we've seen the snail up close, and we love taking its photos. Luckily, we have nothing to worry about when it comes to this vicious predator, but other animals on the seafloor better beware.
So zooming in even further is an organism that you're probably familiar with if you've been to the beach. This is the common rock barnacle, and as the name states, they're very common. You oftentimes find them encrusted in the intertidal zone on rocks or on the sides of boats or piers. Until I started learning more about the marine environment, I really didn't think much of this organism, but they are actually fascinating. They are a shrimp-like organism, so they're very small, and essentially they cement their heads to various surfaces, and then they form little calcium plates surrounding their bodies. When the tide is low and they're in the intertidal zone and exposed, they close the doors of their houses to protect themselves from predation and also to maintain moisture when there's no water around them. However, when the tide is high, they stick their appendages out into the water column and they'll filter feed on microscopic organisms as they float by. As I mentioned, it's their heads that are cemented to the sides of various objects. So their feeding appendages are actually their back legs. Until I started doing these surveys, I had never observed this behavior from a really common organism that I've seen all the time at the beach. And it just really goes to show that when you zoom in a little bit closer, like we have the privilege of doing on our surveys, we get to see some really, really interesting things.
All right, so staying zoomed in here, we have some cute little creatures called sea slugs, also sometimes called nudibranchs. So these animals are really tiny. So for some scale, the bottom photo there, that white orb is actually someone's finger knuckle. So that little organism is about 1 centimeter, if not smaller. and just perched on the top there. So these guys take a lot of really good eyesight to find, especially when they're green and sitting on a piece of green eelgrass. So they're the exact same color as their environment. But they're really, really cool and really rare. So when we do find them, we're so excited. So the one on the right is the Eastern Emerald Elysia, and this is actually a photosynthetic slug, which means it takes its energy from the sunlight, just like a plant would. And what's also really cool about this little guy is that the little flaps on his back actually open up, and it's like a little tiny leaf. So it's really cool, and I definitely recommend Googling that because it's a really cool thing to look at.
All right, so I talked about how we all have a really strong degree of knowledge about what we might expect to find out in the waters of Nova Scotia, but even we can be stumped sometimes, and sometimes we need to ask for help from other scientists across Canada or elsewhere in the world. Here we've got some of the weirdos. So these three pictures counterclockwise are of organisms called hydroids. Hydroids are also related to the cnidarians, so they're part of that jellyfish, coral, anemone family. In fact, all jellyfish actually have a form that looks similar to this. It's called the polyp, and what you see as the free-swimming jellyfish is called the medusa. These are solitary hydroids, which means that they're actually going to spend their lives looking like this. In the bottom left, we've got a weird little organism called a tunicate. And as far as our relationships to these animals go, this is actually one of our closer relatives. It is part of the group called the chordata, which means that it has the precursor elements to what forms our spinal cord.
All right, so on this slide, we have two of our native crab species that we often see on our surveys. On the left-hand side is another fan favorite, the Acadian hermit crab. So what makes these little critters unique is that unlike a lot of other crustaceans, they don't produce their own carapace. They actually rely on foraging empty shells to protect their really soft abdomens. And this means that as the hermit crabs grow, they often have to trade in and trade up to find a bigger shell to house their bodies. This leads to some competition with other hermit crabs for the best homes. On the right-hand side, this grumpy-looking fellow is a Jonah crab. So another one of our native crab species. These are oftentimes the biggest crab that we see on our surveys, and they forage in deeper water, but they oftentimes come up to the intertidal zone. They're also a preferred species for a lot of waterfowl to predate upon, so they're pretty good at camouflage and hiding, and we do get excited when we see them. Here on this slide is an invasive crab species. So this is the pretty well-known European green crab. And as I mentioned, it is not native to Nova Scotia. So this picture really demonstrates the attitude of these crabs quite well. This crab is missing an arm, and it's also eating a sand lance. So they're really voracious predators, and they cause a problem here because they compete with our native crab species for food resources and also for habitat. And they're also really destructive to our native eelgrass beds, which, as Madie mentioned, are really important habitat for a lot of species that we have here. The green crab does like to rip it up. So unfortunately, they are oftentimes the dominant crab species that we see on our surveys. One final note about these crabs is that they're not always green, so that's not always an indication of what species they are. Some of the ID features of them is a really characteristic diamond-shaped shell, as you can see in the photo in the bottom right, as well as 5 really sharp marginal teeth, kind of between the eyes and the widest point of the crab. So that's how you can tell them apart from our native crab species.
Another pretty nasty invader is the vase tunicate. So remember that weird cousin of ours that we've got. These guys, the tunic that gives rise to the name tunicate, so their outer covering, is actually pretty tough and leathery, and so it's kind of hard for other animals to eat if they're not specialized in eating these tunicates. Being non-native species, a lot of their natural predators are absent from our waters, and this allows them to sort of grow unabated without competition. And you can see in this picture here that they are really occupying all the available space on this boulder. So they're taking that away from our native species of algae and other sessile invertebrates. These are also a pretty significant biofouling organism, so they grow on all sorts of instruments in the water, buoys, and boat hulls. So there's a little bit of an economic impact there as well, because if you've got a whole bunch of these growing on your boat and they're creating drag, it's always going to take you more fuel to get to your destination, and you're going to get there slower. Perhaps one of the nastiest invaders here right now on the East Coast is actually this unassuming little organism called a bryozoan. This is called Membranipara. It is a colonial animal, so it's not actually an algae. Each one of these little cells that you see in this picture is in a single organism. What these guys do, or what this organism does, is it grows in sort of a crust on the blades of kelp. And so what it does to the kelp is sort of threefold. First, it makes the kelp's blade more brittle and more susceptible to breaking. By covering the available surface on the kelp's blade, it actually limits photosynthesis. And finally, it also prevents the kelp from releasing its spores by forming that crust. So this little invader is actually one of the big reasons that we're noticing a decline of kelp on the eastern shores of North America.
On that note, we're going to get into the importance of our work and what all of this means for the broader scientific community and conservation in general. So the first thing that makes our work so important is that what we're doing is observing in situ species interactions. So in situ means unmanipulated and natural setting. So when we're going in and doing these snorkel surveys, we're doing them in a non-extractive and non-destructive way. We are merely observers in the environment, and we're trying to catch animals interacting with each other and their environments in a natural way. This is different from other kinds of survey techniques like trawl surveys or bycatch surveys, where animals are actually extracted from the water and then they're able to be counted and measured. This type of data is important, but what we're doing really provides a snapshot on what's going on in the intertidal zone. So a few examples of the things that we've seen here in this large picture is a sand shrimp that is feasting on a deceased lion's mane jelly. And this was observed in West Mabou Beach in Cape Breton. And it was really interesting for us to see this animal eating the jellyfish, because we actually observed it eating the lion's mane's tentacles. So this could be an indicator that the shrimp is not affected by the stinging cells of the jellyfish. And it was just in general awesome to see a ton of sand shrimp feeding on this jellyfish. Then on the top right, we have a moon snail, like the ones I talked about earlier. But this one, instead of eating just small, unsuspecting snails, it's actually taking on a full crab as its meal. So this was a really crazy find. We haven't seen this before or since, and it really is a nod to how voracious this animal truly is. And then on the bottom is a really exciting picture that Madie took. You can see two hermit crabs actually fighting over one shell. And then on the wings, you see two other hermit crabs waiting idly by to see who the successful hermit crab is going to be, so that they could swap shells with them as well. So this shell swap scene was something that I've never seen. I don't think anyone else on the team has seen this, but this was a really exciting interaction that we saw between hermit crabs.
So one of the other really big things that we get out of these surveys is identifying critical habitat for species that are of conservation concern or just otherwise uncommon or rare. So a lot of animals actually have little to no information pertaining to their life histories, like how they reproduce, what they eat growing up, all these sorts of aspects of their lives. On the right, we've got this fish, it's called an Atlantic poacher, And there's really very little known about it. We just know that it sort of occurs off the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and it gets brought up in trawl surveys once in a while. This was a juvenile that we found live swimming around, and so this allows us to make a couple of inferences. We're able to say maybe there is reproduction occurring nearby. Maybe this is important habitat for this fish to forage at this stage in its life. All these in situ observations and where they occur allow us to sort of just shine light on otherwise unknown life cycles. Similarly, we want to track species ranges and distributions, and especially these species of conservation concern or ones that are rare. So pictured here, we've actually got two tropical fish, the spotfin butterfly fish on the left and the bicolored damselfish on the right. These fish are actually more common in the Bahamas. That is really sort of where they're local to. So in the late summer, when we've got hurricanes and all sorts of warm water movement making its way up, sometimes we get tropical species blown up into our environment. Unfortunately, this trip right now is one way for these fish because they cannot survive the cold winter and they're not strong enough to swim back down south. However, it's important to document these occurrences because right now this is actually the furthest north that these fish have ever been recorded. And right now, their trip might be one way and they're not able to establish a permanent population, but that may change in the future. And as that changes, so does the environment. These fish, if they establish a permanent population, they may start eating something that is otherwise not really eaten in the environment, or they might become the preferred prey for another type of fish or predator, leaving its usual prey to explode in population and have different effects. Beyond that, these fish may bring up new parasites or diseases that could affect existing populations in Nova Scotia. So it's important to monitor how these species are distributing across our province. It is pretty cool to see these fish when you're swimming around in Nova Scotia, but it is an important reminder that our environment and our waters are in a constant state of flux and they are dynamic and changing.
So, as we've mentioned, we are very privileged in our work to get to access a lot of remote places in the province. Because these areas are so remote, oftentimes they're hard to get to, which means that sometimes there's not a lot of people visiting and they might be understudied. So, by conducting our surveys in these areas, we get a really good picture of the makeup of these nearshore communities across Nova Scotia, and that helps contribute to the body of knowledge that already exists about these different ecosystems.
So while we're out there collecting all this data and all these photos, we want to be able to share them as much as possible. So we do try to collaborate with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, as well as universities like Dalhousie University. So as we mentioned earlier, we're a partner on an eelgrass restoration project through DAL, as well as some research going on some at-risk species, including Atlantic whitefish and Atlantic salmon. And as we mentioned, we can also inform DFO about new invasive species and their locations, as well as some sensitive species or habitats that we're finding. So generally, our work fills in a data gap for the intertidal environment, and we do that in a way that's non-destructive.
We also, as an organization, engage in a lot of communities. The work that we do is informed by local communities. And then once we have collected our data and wrapped up a field season, the communities that we've done this work in are the first to see our results. So the photo on the left is Hunter and me at our LaHave Islands presentation. After 2 years of doing research in the LaHave Islands, we went back to the community and presented all of our findings, like the ones that you saw today. And these presentations are always really well received. Folks around the province are super excited to see what's going on in the intertidal zone in their communities. And both events that we put on in LaHave were fully booked out. We had to turn people away at the door. So there's a lot of excitement around Nova Scotia for what's in our waters. And similarly, we like to bring people into the water with us. So we do snorkel workshops. And this one pictured here was the one we did with the Diversity of Nature group out of Dalhousie. And it's a way to bring outdoor opportunities to students who might not have them otherwise, as well as to use our expertise and safety training to hopefully inspire the next generation of scientists. So if you're wondering how you can support or get involved with the work that we do, we'd first and foremost like to say that the best way to do this is to follow us on social media and engage with our content. We have Instagram, Facebook, Twitter or X, and YouTube, and we're always posting our fieldwork expeditions there and sharing our findings pretty much live as we do them. So the more followers and more engagement we can get, the better, and we can just keep doing what we do and bringing the ocean world to you.
Another really easy way to get involved just in citizen science and conservation across the province, not even necessarily in the marine environment, but on land too, is by getting involved with iNaturalist. So iNaturalist, if you're unfamiliar, is a website or app where you take a picture or audio recording of just some evidence that an organism was there, whether it's a footprint or a bird call or a picture of the animal itself. You post that to iNaturalist, and based on the location, the time of year, iNaturalist will suggest what that animal may actually be, animal or plant may be. This is a really great app because scientists around the world actually use this. And once you post this observation, these scientists will sort of come and verify what you saw. You say, yes, that is actually what is pictured, or they'll disagree, usually tell you why. It's kind of like having a whole bunch of professors in your pocket. It's really helped me to just sort of take my own knowledge a little bit further. Whenever we see something a little bit weird, it's always iNaturalist that I put it on as the first thing, just so I can get some other insight from other experts in the field and help me verify this sighting. We use a project feature of iNaturalist to create an inventory of the marine biodiversity that occurs off the Sambro ledges. Sambro Ledges is just a defined region that sort of is right off the head of the Chebucto Peninsula, and it wraps around towards Prospect. So we work with the local scuba diving community to just say, hey, when you're going out there, if you've got a GoPro with you and you see something interesting and you take a picture or a video, consider putting that onto iNaturalist, and it'll automatically get added to our project, and we can verify what it is and what you saw. So at the time of this screenshot, you can see that we had 353 species observed by 409 different people. So that's pretty cool, and it's pretty easy to get involved and get started with this. It is free. You don't have to pay for this service. So really suggest that you get involved with this.
Oh, Taylor.
Oh, the side of the slide just slipped. The last thing that you can do is to subscribe to our email list for updates and calls to action. So you can do that by scanning the QR code that you see here or visiting our website, CPAWS-NS.org. We don't send out too much in the way of emails, but we do send out important campaign updates and calls to action. So this is a really great way to stay informed and engaged with the work that we're doing across the province.
All right, so we made it to the end of our presentation. We really thank you for tuning in and listening to us chat about our work and how much we love the ocean. Again, we have our social media handles up there and also our emails in case you have questions, comments, or want to learn more about getting involved or collaborating with us maybe. So we really hope that you enjoyed yourself and learned a lot today, and we hope to see you again in the future. So thank you.